there, and a very warm welcome. You with World is One News. I'm Molly Gambhir. You're watching the special edition this evening. The Prime Minister returned to India on Saturday evening after a successful G20 meeting in Hamburg, where he held a number of bilaterals with important world leaders. Putting forward India's interest, the visit not only created new diplomatic partners for India, but infused a new energy in existing ties, strengthening India's position in a changing world order. Here's a report on that. India made major contributions to the security agenda at the Hamburg summit, including suggesting a radical new approach to fighting global terror by targeting officials from nations that support terrorists. India's Sherpa at the G20, economist Arvind Panagria, also said that India had a major influence on counter-terrorism discussions and played a leading role in talks on trade and investment as well as climate change. Observers have claimed that it was the Prime Minister's personal equations established over the last 3 years with world leaders that enabled India to make its mark at the summit. The Prime Minister met leaders from a number of countries and ensured that India's interests were secured. India's suggestions on fighting terror reflected in the final declaration at the Hamburg summit. Foreign policy experts point out that the Prime Minister has already transformed India's diplomatic agenda into a more impactful one. Mr. Modi has met with over 30 leaders in just 3 years in office, reaching out to establish personal relationships with several of the world's most powerful. He has also ensured that India's strategic goals are clearly outlined. According to sources, the handshake between the Prime Minister and China's Xi Jinping was a result of the personal equation shared between the two leaders. US President Donald Trump also walked up to the Prime Minister for an impromptu talk on the sidelines of the G20 meeting. The two leaders had met on 26 June in Washington. Bureau Report, WION. Proactive, resolute, unpredictable, dynamic, enlightened, nimble, tenacious. And voila, we have a prudent foreign policy taking shape under Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Mr. Modi has set a scorching pace, travelling on 67 foreign tours in 3 years. Unlike his predecessors, he includes as many countries as he can every time he travels. Most recently, he combined Portugal and the Netherlands with his visit to the United States. In doing so, he became the first Indian Prime Minister ever to pay a bilateral visit to Portugal. He has visited the US 5 times already, France and Russia on 3 occasions, and Japan, Singapore, Germany and some countries in India's neighborhood on 2 occasions, not to mention Israel, the only time an Indian Prime Minister has visited that nation in 7 decades. Neighbourhood first is a key element of Mr. Modi's foreign policy. It was in full display on 26th May 2014, the day he was inaugurated as India's 15th Prime Minister, when the leaders of 7 South Asian countries and Mauritius were in attendance. His other policies of Act East, formerly Look East, and Link West have attracted international attention. Multi-alignment is another unmistakable dimension to Mr. Modi's foreign policy. Besides the optics and his now famous bear hugs, lies a carefully crafted engagement driven in part by India's developmental needs and peace and security. Gone is the diffidence that afflicted successive Indian governments. The surgical strikes on the border with Myanmar in 2015, the 2016 surgical strikes along the line of control in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, and the resolute action on the border standoff with China are good examples of a newfound confidence. And he has ensured that India's voice is heard loud and clear on the world stage. raising the issue of cross-border terrorism at every multilateral forum, be it the G20, East Asia Summit or the UN. What's more, he's been meticulous and prudent in sleeping on his Air India One rather than a hotel in order to save time and resources, choosing to get briefings in flight and walking in straight to his next engagement upon landing at his destination.
It's a marriage really made in heaven, but we're implementing it here on.
Well, that sums up for us and in a way sets the tone for what we are going to be discussing over the next few minutes with the help of our panelists. Joining us on the broadcast at this point is Professor Brahma Chelani. He is Professor of Strategic Studies at the Center for Policy Research. He served as a member of the Policy Advisory Group headed by the Foreign Minister of India. Also joining us on the broadcast is WION Senior Correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran. Professor Chelani, coming to you first, your assessment of how the Prime Minister has over the last 3 years ensured that India's diplomatic agenda is made more impactful.
Indian foreign policy under Modi has become dynamic, forward-looking, and also it appears that India is going from being non-aligned to being multi-aligned. What does multi-alignment mean? It means that India is building strategic partnerships and mutually beneficial relationships with all the important powers in the world. So India is not hesitant now to take a position on important issues. Earlier, non-alignment meant neutrality, being somewhat passive. India is now willing to engage dynamically and not play a passive role, but it's willing to play an activist role on issues where its interests are very much at stake.
Absolutely. Coming to you now, Ramesh, Prime Minister Modi's personal touch, in a way, putting domestic initiative on the global map. Your reading also of the recent G20 summit.
Right, Molly, and just aside, Professor Chelani put it better, Molly. Dynamic and multi-aligned foreign policy is what everybody, most of us see Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy in the last 3 years. But that said, in the context of G20 and in multilateral institutions, Molly, we've seen Prime Minister Modi have a top-down approach. By that I mean, setting the agenda, as it were, in his relentless pursuit of first-life diplomacy. He has invested time, energy, and effort into establishing personal rapport with world leaders in the hope that it will trickle down to the bureaucracy who are particularly, suffering from inertia. To that extent, this is a new trend insofar as India's foreign policy is concerned, one which is led from the front, as it were, by none other than the Prime Minister himself. And it remains to be seen how the bureaucracy and the official dump, as it were, in India responds to his cue, as it were.
Right, and taking a cue from the point that we are discussing at this point, the personal touch, the more personalized foreign policy of the Prime Minister over the last 3 years. Coming to you, Professor Chelani, and then to Ramesh on the same aspect of how, amidst the border standoff, we've seen the Indian Prime Minister shaking hands with the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. Your assessment of that and how, in a way, that was, as many experts have pointed out, a result of a personal equation between the two leaders.
Prime Minister Modi has invested considerable capital in building a personal relationship with President Xi Jinping of China. Unfortunately, that investment hasn't paid off because under Xi Jinping, China has increasingly become more and more hostile towards India. So Modi has tried to befriend Xi Jinping. He has gone out of his way to befriend Xi Jinping. But China's policy toward India remains pretty hardline, and we're not seeing any kind of softening in that policy. Prime Minister Modi's brief meeting with President Xi on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Hamburg was important because, on one hand, India is delivering a very tough message that India will not back down from the standoff on Doklam Plateau. India will hold this ground because the plateau belongs to Bhutan, and India is beholden by treaty to aid Bhutan's national defense. On the other hand, by meeting with Xi Jinping, Modi conveyed the message that India was open to a diplomatic solution to the standoff. So it was a mixed message that India will stay tough as far as the military standoff is concerned, but diplomatically India is willing to look for a possible solution.
Ramesh, your assessment of that handshake between the two leaders amidst that or despite that border standoff?
Indeed, as Professor Chilani pointed out, to my mind, India and China relationship in the past 3 years has been marked by competition and cooperation. Now, we've seen the border standoff coming as it did after India decided to boycott the Belt and Road Initiative. And remember, India and Bhutan were the handful of countries, in addition to Singapore, who chose to either boycott or not participate in the marquee event that was conceptualized and pushed by President Xi Jinping himself. So it had a lot to do with his personality himself, President Xi, and for India to boycott the event send out the right message, according to some, insofar as India-China relations go. But that said, the border standoff comes between India's boycott and Prime Minister Modi's historic visits to Israel and before that to Washington. Modi at the same time, 2 days, in 2 days we'll see the Malabar exercises happen in the Indian Ocean among the navies of India, US, and Japan. So clearly, as far as India-China relations go, things are in a state of flux. It remains to be seen how China chooses to respond to India's concerns, notwithstanding the border standoff. Remember, China claims to be rising peacefully, but if the past is an indicator, then it's a very moot point, Molly.
And terrorism makes a huge chunk while we decode the Prime Minister's foreign policy and the way it's shaped up over the last 3 years. Professor Chilani, the Prime Minister, India's suggestions on fighting terror actually finding significance and being reflected in the final declaration at the Hamburg summit.
That shouldn't give us much satisfaction. The fact is that international terrorism is being fueled by two factors. One is cross-border sponsorship of terrorism, and Pakistan is a prime example of that because it's exporting terrorism not just to India, but to its other neighbors like Afghanistan and Bangladesh, which have both said in recent months that Pakistan is the fountainhead of terrorism. Yet there is no concrete international action to contain the Pakistani problem. The second factor that is fueling international terrorism is the ideology behind terrorism. And that ideology is being exported by Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf sheikdoms. It's this Wahhabi strain of Islam, the extremist strain of Islam, which has instilled the spirit of jihad and martyrdom. And that Wahhabi strain of Islam has snuffed out more liberal Islamic traditions in many countries across the world. Reigning in Saudi Arabia, reigning in Pakistan are essential to containing the scourge of international terrorism. Passing resolutions, articulating lofty ideals is not enough.
Right, Ramesh, drawing global attention on terrorism has been a key takeaway when it comes to most of those meetings that the Prime Minister has had with as many as 30 world leaders over the last 3 years. But speaking specifically on the issue of Pakistan, as Professor Chilani was just pointing out, isolating Pakistan at an international level for sponsoring terrorism, do we see that effort, that constant effort bearing fruit now?
Indeed, Molly, if anything, Prime Minister Modi has been consistently staying on the message. Now, we saw in the 2016, last year's G20, for instance, and the East Asia Summit, which happened in the aftermath of the cross-border terrorist attacks perpetrated by Pakistan against India. We saw Prime Minister Modi talk about terrorism and cross-border terrorism in particular, and he stayed on that message consistently since then. At every multilateral forum, be it the G20 or the East Asia Summit or even under the aegis of the UN, he's consistently raised this point across about cross-border terrorism in particular. And we see that manifest itself in this particular government's foreign policy. We saw that manifest in the 2015 surgical strikes on the border with Myanmar. And last year, the surgical strikes at the line of control in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, where we saw India take out the terrorist hideouts or the camps or the launching pad, as it were, on the other side of the LOC. So clearly, India's foreign policy the last 3 years has swung between diffidence, defiance, and determination. And that, to my mind, is a indication of a more robust foreign policy pursued by Prime Minister Modi.
Right, we'll just come back to discussing more on the issue of terrorism, but I want to quickly also take in a reaction from Professor Chilani specifically on Indo-US relations. Professor Chilani, the US president actually walking up to the Indian Prime Minister on the sideline of the G20 meeting and actually making an impromptu conversation with the Indian Prime Minister. A sample perhaps of the bonhomie. Do we see that increasing between the two leaders?
Trump and Modi have a good equation. They have established a personal relationship. And certainly Trump seems to like Modi genuinely. But we should also bear in mind that at Hamburg, despite this impromptu, informal engagement that Trump had with Modi, Trump had formal bilateral meetings with President Xi Jinping of China and Prime Minister Abe of Japan. And after meeting with Xi Jinping of China, Trump reasserted the conciliatory tone that his administration has adopted toward China. So that is not good news for India. The fact that US policy toward China still remains rather soft, still is unwilling to crack the whip, and unwilling to stop Chinese incremental aggression that is taking place in the South and East China Seas and the Himalayas. So on one hand, US-Indian relations are becoming deeper, the two countries are getting closer. On the other hand, US policy, as under Obama, so too under Trump, seems unwilling to take on China.
Ramesh, Sayyid Salahuddin being designated as a global terrorist in the run-up to that meeting between the two leaders, between Prime Minister Modi and US President Donald Trump, was that an indication of how seriously the United States is viewing India?
Indeed, Molly, India has been making incremental progress on the issue of calling Pakistan's bluff, as it were, on the international stage, and reminding and asking and urging the international community to lean on Pakistan and to make it desist from launching terrorist attacks targeted mainly at India. But that said, other countries in the neighborhood are equally victims of terrorism emanating from Pakistan, mainly Afghanistan. So clearly the international opinion is changing, but not changing as fast as probably India would have liked it to. But that said, Molly, one key takeaway from Prime Minister Modi's policy vis-a-vis Pakistan is, even when he was candidate, Modi was very candid and said with abundant candor that one cannot talk with an interlocutor when guns are blazing on behind you or around you. So clearly that has stayed with his government even after he became Prime Minister. And we saw on the 26th of May 2014, Prime Minister Modi take the initiative to invite all the South Asian leaders, including Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, for inauguration. And then we saw him insist that he's in favor of a composite bilateral dialogue. In other words, there's no third stakeholder in this process. It's only India and Pakistan. And then we also saw Prime Minister Modi think out of the box when he landed in Lahore to wish Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif on his birthday in 2015. So he is, to my mind, he has done everything that a Prime Minister of India should have in the last 3 years. But only expected that Pakistan will not probably respond in kind.
Right, stay with us, Ramesh. Before we completely run out of time, Professor Chilani, I also want to touch upon the aspect of Russia. Now, infusing new energy when it comes to the relationship between India and Russia, and also, for example, the Russian participation in the Smart City project. According to you, where are relations between India and Russia headed?
Russia is an old and reliable partner of India. This relationship has stood the test of time, but some important developments are taking place which are not to very conducive to India's long-term interests. American sanctions against Russia are pushing Russia in a direction that is antithetical to India's interests. For example, in Afghanistan, Russia is building cozy ties with the Taliban to countervail the American military in Afghanistan. But India's interests are completely different. India's interests cannot be aligned with the interests of the Taliban. Similarly, American sanctions are forcing Russia to pivot toward China. In other words, American sanctions against Russia are proving counterproductive to India's long-term interests because they are forcing Russia to do things which are not exactly in line with India's own interests. But as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned, that relationship politically is still very close. The relationship, however, in the economic area, the Russia-India relationship economically is declining, and that decline needs to be arrested because the trade now between Russia and India is pretty small given the size of these two countries.
Right, Ramesh, and how can we not touch upon the recent Israel visit? Was that, according to you, a sign of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's shifting foreign policy calculus in a way?
Not really, Molly. In a sense, he has continued, India's policy towards Israel over the decades, especially since he established diplomatic relations 25 years ago. But that said, what he has done is to de-hyphenate India's ties with Palestine on the one hand and Israel on the other. But that said, his continuity in India's foreign policy, especially under Prime Minister Modi, the link to West policy, as it is called, which complements Prime Minister Modi's Act-East policy. He has visited Israel after touring almost all countries of consequence in West Asia, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and other countries in the Gulf. So one can't really blame Prime Minister Modi for choosing to visit Israel in the manner he did. But that said, it is a newfound confidence, as it were, on the part of India to de-hyphenate ties with both Palestine and Israel and to treat each relationship independently. And that, to my mind, is a new development, and some would say welcome development as well.
Right, Professor Chilani, coming to you lastly on the aspect of the Make in India approach, the neighborhood first policy, and also your takeaways, largely speaking, from the recent G20 meeting.
The most important international forum. The G20 has replaced the G7 as the main forum for discussions and decisions on international issues, extending from international finance and trade to climate change and even political issues that impinge on regional and international security. The G20 actually brings together the wealthy economies, the old economic giants, as well as the emerging economies, the new economic giants. So it bridges the divide between the old and new economic giants. In this forum, Prime Minister Modi did play a very important role in rebuilding ties, personal ties with important world leaders. He also had an opportunity to re-engage with, for example, Prime Minister Abe of Japan. Japan is India's natural ally, and Japanese and Indian interests now increasingly converge in Asia and even beyond Asia. But I think as far as Make in India initiative of Prime Minister is concerned, is trying to implement that initiative. He's facing important hurdles. The fact is that India's manufacturing base is quite limited. And also these large imports of weapons that Prime Minister Modi is making do not really fit very well with this Make in India initiative. And yet he's struggling to implement this initiative in the coming years. So it's going to be a struggle to make in India a success, but it's worth the try because India cannot remain an import-dependent economy. India is the only Asian economy that does not rely on exports to drive its growth, but actually is import-dependent and relies on domestic consumption for its growth.
All right. Professor Chilani and Ramesh Ramachandran. Appreciate your joining us on this special broadcast as we continue to decode Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy and the main takeaways from the same. With that, it's also a wrap on this special edition. That, of course, is a summary of what the Indian Prime Minister's foreign policy has been looking like and the way it's shaped up over the last 3 years. That, of course, tells us of the manner and the robust initiative that the Prime Minister has been taking. With that, it's a wrap on this edition, but stay tuned to more news and updates coming up in our special edition at 9 p.m.
Modi is making do not